Welcome everybody to the HxEast Asia forum, starting off with a very interesting presentation on COVID-19 and religious freedom in South Korea, focusing on the controversial religious sect Shincheonji, whose members were blamed and persecuted for the spread of COVID-19 in South Korea. I forgot to mention, my name is Francis. I'm a core member of this chapter of Heterodox Academy, and I'll be moderating today. So we are delighted to have Professor Holly Folk, Professor of Religious Studies in the Global Humanities Department, giving us a presentation on this topic. And we also have speakers, Joseph Yee, who of course is well acquainted with all of you, political science professor at Hanyang University, as well as John Grisafi, PhD graduate in religious studies at Yale University, and Kenji, there he is. There's Kenji. Hi, Kenji. Kenji Yoshida, who is a contributor at Japan Forward. So Holly will be presenting for about 20 to 25 minutes. The other speakers will have 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll have some Q&A. And I believe there are some public comments. So while Holly gets started with the presentation, I'll just add a link to the public comments to the chat so everyone can see what the discussion has been so far and contribute as they see fit. So without further ado, may I give the floor to Holly.
There it goes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for that warm welcome, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in Heterodox Academy Asia and for the ability to present a little bit of my research. I am going to talk, I think, more about the context for the controversy than the controversy itself, because the steps for the controversy are, in some ways, I think, not just boilerplate, but they're only part of a larger social problem. And I also think that my goal with talking about new religious movements very often is to humanize them and to make it understandable why what they're choosing as religious options are viable options for the people who participate, even in groups that are controversial. And so I want to explain some things about Shincheonji's history and its theology, to put in the context for Korea, and also to account a little bit for why there's ongoing hostility against the group. I realize that there's probably a pretty wide spectrum of familiarity with Shincheonji, given that this is a class that's happening in Korea, and there are also some people from different parts of the world participating. And so I'm hoping to hit a happy medium with explaining what I know. But if I'm redundant, I apologize, and if I don't say enough, I also apologize. I know things about Shincheonji for a couple of reasons. For close to a decade, I've been researching new Christian religions in Asia. I started with the Church of Almighty God. I'm writing a book on the Unification Church. And so Shincheonji is one group and part of a larger inquiry and study, and yet in many, many ways, it resonates with a number of other movements. I think the place where Shincheonji is unique, and I think this is very, very important for understanding why it's controversial, is that Shincheonji, more than any other group I have found, mounts a sharp ecclesiastical critique, and what's first in its line of fire are other Korean Protestant churches. And so it is, in my own opinion, a little bit understandable why there is so much social friction. So let me turn to my notes. I've already put this in the chat if people want to follow along. I don't really want to share screen because I want people to be able to see stuff, but I'm looking at my notes now, and so please bear with me. I'd like to start with some institutional history to say that Lee Man-hee, who is the founder of Shincheonji, was born in 1931. He's an interesting person. He foretells that he is not going to die, or at least his earthly body won't die. And he is in his late 90s right now, mid 90s, and he is still going strong, which is just super, super impressive as far as I'm concerned. Between 1967 and 1984, Lee participated in sorry to take that back. Between 1957 and 1967, Lee participated in a movement called the Olive Tree, which for people who are from Korea would know was founded in the 1950s by a gentleman named Park Tae-sun, and it comes out of a series of Korean revivals that happened in the 1930s and 1940s. The Olive Tree movement ended with a big public relations disaster and the fall of Park Tae-sun as a leader. Man-hee Lee was not the only person who left the movement, and so between 1967 and 1984, he participated in a group that had schismed out called the Tabernacle Temple. In 1984, the Tabernacle Temple was also folding amid a financial scandal with their leader, and the remains were being incorporated into the Presbyterian Church in Korea. And Lee Man-hee founded Shincheonji with a small group of Tabernacle Temple members. This sounds sort of, esoteric. Why am I giving this history? But in fact, this feeds in directly to how they understand the Book of Revelations, and they map a number of different Korean churches and figures to symbols from the Book of Revelation. So we'll pick that up in a second. In 1990, Shincheonji started the Zion Christian Mission Center, which comes to operate the Bible study courses and exams for which they're known today. And also in 1995, their system for geographic divisions known as the 12 tribes were established. And these are divisions that structure the church in Korea and also organize its international missions, which are now in 29 countries. The first mission to the West was in Los Angeles in 1996. By 2007, Shincheonji had 45,000 members, mostly in Korea, but in several continents as well, and in cities including Berlin, Sydney, and Cape Town. Their NGO, Heavenly Culture World Peace Restoration of Light, which is called HWPL, was founded in 2013, and 4 years later, Heavenly Culture World Peace Restoration of Light obtained special consultative status at the United Nations Economic and Social Council. By 2018, Shincheonji had 200,000 members, mostly young people in Korea, but also in a number of other countries. And just as a side note, one of the byproducts of the COVID-19 investigation was the official confirmation that by 2020, membership had exceeded 300,000 people. So it's really had kind of a rocket growth over the past 30, 40 years. Most of the converts are young people who are very idealistic, and most of the converts are people who are coming out of other Christian churches, which is, I think, one of the reasons why it is controversial. I'm sorry, I need to cough a second. Excuse me. Let me say a few things about its theology, and I'll try to go fast here. But I think this is very interesting, and it's not very well known. Shincheonji has a strong symbolic interpretation of the Bible. They say God uses the characteristics of things in the physical world, which can easily be easily observed, to figuratively describe things in the spiritual world, which cannot be easily observed. And so, in other words, they use the term figurative in a way that sort of explains the sort of limited magical quality to how they understand the Bible. The theological term for this is that they're cessationist. They reject supernaturalism in our era. And like many Adventists, they believe that in our time, God will be practical in his dealings with people. God will not try to dazzle humanity with tricks to upend material laws. I think this is really important, and I think it's very often not really understood that Shincheonji has a very lucid, in some ways very scientific understanding of the world. They are very reality-based. They are not expecting demons to start flying around in ways that are visible. They're not anticipating anything like the Left Behind series. They are people whose views really do comport with reality. On the other hand, their worldview is very strongly enchanted, and they see the Bible as a record and foretelling of events transpiring things both in our world and in the world beyond. Shincheonji, like a number of other Asian Christian religions, believe that there are parallels between the material world and the spiritual world, and they believe that there is a conflict between God and Satan that is happening in both of these realms. In the spiritual world, angels fight with God against Satan, and in the physical world, many of Satan's forces have incarnated as the clergy of other Christian denominations. This is what I'm saying as far as I'm concerned, a great cause of controversy. Two key examples which show up in a great deal of Shincheonji literature and scripture are the lampstands and the tabernacle, which are mentioned in the book of Revelation. These are understood to be the founders of the tabernacle temple, and also certain figures known as the Nicolaitans in Revelation were identified as corrupt church leaders in Korea, and specifically the members of the Stewardship Education Center, a Presbyterian-affiliated organization that is seen to have caused the collapse of the Tabernacle Temple. And so, in other words, they've ingrained into their theology certain very sharp critiques against Korean Protestant denominations. And I think that's already baked into the cake for them. They also believe, and I think this is interesting, that the end time battle will be won when a sufficient number of people have joined with God against the forces of Satan so as to secure a victory. In other words, they're not expecting a battle on the plain of Armageddon over in the land of Israel. They are saying that the battles of the end times are being fought right now for the hearts and souls of people. And the process of conversion and joining God's side is the very, very much an earthly expression of this sort of cosmic conflict foretold in prophecy and Revelation. It's also important to know that Manhee is understood for the most part as a human being and not as God. There's been controversy about that. He is regarded as the promised pastor, a figure who would lead God's kingdom of heaven on earth as prophesied in the Bible. I think this is very interesting. It is not very often that you find prophetic leaders who come in with an ecclesiastical mission. La Luz del Mundo, which is a group from Mexico, and Iglesia Ni Cristo from the Philippines also basically see their leaders as pastors or apostles or figures who will have kind of a leadership governance role for humanity. But these are not people who are understood specifically as messiahs. They're people who are understood with a very practical role for being the leader of the church. And so I think that that's also a reinforcement of the fact that in certain ways, this is a very this worldly new religion. Lee Man-hee has claimed that he himself will live to see the start of the millennium, which Shincheonji believers believe will happen fairly soon. And so, in other words, even though he's understood as a human being because of his position in the end times, it's foretold he will not die an earthly death. There is some ambiguity about how a divine force, possibly the Christ spirit, may have aligned with Lee's soul. This is not something that is really fully spelled out in Shincheonji literature that I've been able to see. Moving quickly, because I don't want to take too much time, I'll say that Shincheonji also aligns the souls of the ancient Israelites with modern believers, and I've heard different things about how this works, so the specifics are not clear, but they do believe that the 144,000 overcomers or martyrs will rule with Christ in heaven, and the great white multitude will enjoy 1,000 years of life on earth. And so in some of this theology, they are very similar to other Advent Christian groups, like, for example, the Jehovah's Witnesses. There are two incentives to joining Shincheonji: one, to purify oneself of original sin, which is known as overcoming, and to survive the end time so as to reach the millennium. There are analogs to other Korean Christianities in these beliefs. Foremost, because in the spiritual realm, Satan sinned and separated from God. In the physical realm, two seeds, the seed of God and the seed of Satan, were sowed in the heart of humans. In many Korean Christian groups, there's a notion that the fall of humanity between Adam and Eve instilled a biological flaw from Satan, and this derives from 18th century Protestant theology where people talked about Satan's seed. Shincheonji also teaches that events prophesied in the book of Revelation were physically fulfilled in Korea in the 20th century, and that's something else that we see in many other Korean Christian religions, where there really is a prioritization of the Korean peninsula. There are other ideas with which Shincheonji echoes somewhat, tracing back to groups from the 1930s and 1940s, including the Olive Tree, also the Holy Lord Church inside the Belly Church, Israel Monastery, and the Wilderness Church. These are all forms of Korean Christianity that trace their origins to a series of revivals in the 1930s. which had a number of ideas that are distinct and hold together. Original sin as fornication, an emphasis on blood lineage being very connected to how humanity has taken on original sin, the notion of the possibility, necessity of overcoming original sin, sometimes for some groups, but not for Shincheonji, the notion of Pikarium, which comes from Korean shamanism and includes sexual rituals for purification, and then also, again, identification of Korea as a very important site for Christ's return. As mentioned earlier, um, membership in Shincheonji happens through both baptism and graduation from a Bible study course, which is a 300-question examination focusing on the Book of Revelation. To be honest, there are different assessments of this test. If you look on the internet or read people's statements, some people say this is very rigorous and difficult. Other people say it's actually quite easy. So I guess somebody would have to take it and make that decision. They have church services twice a week. Members are known to wear white as a symbol of purity. They kneel during the services, and so therefore there are very seldom chairs. Most people are kneeling on the floor. Their big holiday is Passover. They do not celebrate Christmas or Easter. There are a number of different missionary organizations associated with them, including Para Cristo, the Manam Volunteer Organization, and the Zion Christian Center. Okay, moving to COVID, and I know I don't want to take people's time too much. Shincheonji's rapid growth happened largely by converting members of other Christian churches. There are accusations against them of sheep stealing, of heresy, and of also being a cult. I can say I had a really poignant conversation at one point with one of their lawyers. And he said to me that he had belonged to another church and he was a stolen sheep and he was very happy to be stolen. And so I think that that's something that's important to tuck in there, that the people who are being recruited from other Christian churches are making an intentional choice to join Shincheonji. Regardless, there have been stereotypes about cults promoted by both secular media and conservative fundamentalist churches. Then and now, this is an ongoing problem. And since the early 2000s in Korea, Shincheonji members have been subjected to deprogramming, mostly done by Korean Protestant pastors who have side businesses as exit counselors. I visited Shincheonji in December and November of 2019, so right before the COVID epidemic. So it was really sort of hit home for all of us on that trip. And when we were there, we attended a conference that focused on deprogramming. And in 2018, 2019, in Shincheonji in Korea, something like 3 people a week were being abducted and brought into deprogramming experiences, which is really sort of a very major human rights violation. Let me say some things about COVID because that's why we're here. Until the winter of 2019-2020, this is not always very well known, Shincheonji had a church in Wuhan. And so one of the reasons why there was a focus on Wuhan and Shincheonji was because there were people who were traveling back and forth and there was a certain amount of exchange. On the other hand, there are other religions and cultural organizations and businesses and companies that have contacts in Chinese cities. And it's not necessarily the fact that only Shincheonji was traveling to China. One can travel from China to Korea without a visa, or at least could at the time. On February 7th, 2020, a 61-year-old female member named Patient 31 was announced in Daegu. She was in a car accident then, and it was thought she had a cold. She was sent home from the hospital, but she returned. 12 days later, this woman, Patient 31, was identified as a super spreader in Shincheonji. Thousands of members tested positive, although this was probably due to the fact that only Shincheonji members were being tested. And so if only Shincheonji people are being tested, or if they're the majority of people being tested and they test positive even at a normal rate, they're going to look like the super spreaders. As a result, all Shincheonji churches and facilities were ordered closed. There were accusations of Shincheonji intentionally spreading the virus. In other words, they said because they accused Shincheonji member of attending other church services in order to spread COVID, which was clearly not happening. There was an anonymous online petition sent to the Blue House calling for the abolition of Shincheonji. And then there were other problems. Shincheonji was accused of hiding its membership lists. And to be fair, there are civil liberty questions to ask about the demand that they provide all of their international membership information. Ultimately, courts found that Shincheonji acted in good faith. There were only a few names not provided, and those were in cases where there was no actually working contact information. So in other words, if somebody had stopped by a center, attended a couple of classes, left, moved away, was no longer a member, but there was some record of their name, some of those people could not be provided to the government. Generally speaking, Shincheonji provided all but a handful of contacts. In March 2020, regardless, Lee Man-hee held a press conference, and he personally apologized for any harm the religion may have caused the society. That didn't help the fact that on May 22nd, all the major facilities in Korea were raided by the police, and in June, the city of Daegu sued Shincheonji and Chairman Lee for recovery of its COVID-19 related costs, $82.3 million. A few days later, Shincheonji embarked on a blood drive in which 4,000 members participated in the hope of doing some type of atonement and also helping society. Regardless, on the night of July 31st to August 1st, Lee Man-hee was arrested. Originally, it was mentioned that they would charge him for attempted murder. That charge was quickly converted to obstructing disease response efforts, and that trial proceeded through a couple of stages. In January 2021, Lee Man-hee was acquitted of those charges of obstructing the government response to COVID-19, but that same court indicted him on charges of embezzlement and of holding unauthorized events in 2015 and 2019. In 2022, the Supreme Court confirmed for these alleged offenses a sentence of 3 years for Chairman Lee, although that was suspended. So it's important to note that Shincheonji was found innocent of obstruction of disease efforts at 3 levels: in the Suwon District Court in January 2021, on appeal by the Suwon High Court on November 2021, and then also again finally at the Supreme Court of South Korea in August of 2022. Things going on right now, post-COVID. In November 2024, it was announced that 111,628 graduates of the Bible course were reported for the 2024 year. Currently, global membership is estimated at 311,000, and I get the sense that an increasing portion of members are becoming inactive. And so despite the rapid growth at the beginning, I think what we're now starting to see is attrition. This is normal for groups that have lots and lots of joiners who are young, who don't stay very long. And so in other words, the group is growing, but I expect some of its population to sort of taper. It may stay steady. It may grow at a slower rate. Shincheonji continues to have problems with the government in Korea. In fall 2024, they were hoping to hold a religious leaders forum and graduation ceremony in Paju. As it happened, there were protests because there was an abrupt cancellation of their permit. The government stated that they could not hold the event out of concern it may provoke North Korea, which is a very sort of strange thing to say. I don't want to bring up the 2 super apostates beyond saying that they continue to be sort of difficult public relations problems for Shincheonji, and they've agitated a lot in Korean society. But let me just sort of close with my reflections. I know I'm almost out of time. First of all, in Korea and in other Asian countries and in other parts of the world, I'm led to compare the increasing and ongoing difficulties of Shincheonji with those faced by other religious minorities. This is a problem in a number of countries right now. In Korea and elsewhere, there's a rising view that new religions are problematic. And this is a view that is shared by religious people in Korea with a particular antagonism to Shincheonji and also by secular people. And my sense of things is that secular populations around the world right now are increasingly feeling that religion is sort of toxic and not helpful in society. Korea has a super added problem where there's a very strong cultural belief that nonconformity is antisocial. And so, in other words, to join a new religious movement is in itself a larger transgression in the context of Korean society. One also has to observe that in Korea, as in Asia and also Japan, many religions are imbricated with politics. So that means they're able to act through government bodies, but it also means that if they're on the wrong side of a religious debate, they may become targeted by government operations. Um, it's sad and tragic that COVID-19 has been permanently established as part of Shincheonji's public history. Somebody said it's almost synonymous right now. I think that that may have been John. Totally, totally right. Um, and I would also note that the case of Shincheonji has been used to argue for the potential of religious groups to cause a number of different types of harm, whether that's physical, psychological, or social. And this I see something very important for Heterodox Academy to be aware of and to take up. There's a global campaign right now as seen in activism against many other groups in order to render religious belief suspect. And I'll say this here because I speak about this in a number of different forums. Shincheonji is, as far as I'm concerned, a near enemy. It's a group that provides lots and lots of reasons to dislike it. But the legislation that's being proposed against it, and the public relations campaign against it, I think of as efforts not just to solve a problem with a near enemy, but to make larger changes in a free society and to change how people think about not just religion, but also to think about secular conscience. And so, in other words, whether you're religious or not, this is something about which people should care. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that fascinating. Oh, yeah. Thank you so much for that fascinating coverage, Holly. I guess I'm coming from this from an Australian perspective, so I have so many questions about, the different, I guess different levels of knowledge people have of Shincheonji. But I'll hold my questions for now, and perhaps we'll move on to John, Joseph, and then Kenji. Does that order sound okay?
Yes, Joseph. Okay.
Okay. Let's move on to John then. Would you like to go next?
No, it's actually Joseph, Kenji, and
Oh,
then John.
Joseph, Kenji, and then John. Okay, that's fine. All right, Joseph, do you want to take it away?
Okay, I shared my screen.
Sure.
For those who are on the registration page, you can just click on the public comments, and then you can see what I'm saying. I
Would
first
you
want to
be
give
able
a
to
shout
speak a
out.
bit closer to the microphone? Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, perfect.
So if you're on the registration page, you can click on the public comments, and then you can see the same document that I'm saying. I first want to give a shout out to Holly and to Western Washington University's Heterodox Academy chapter who are co-sponsoring this. Again, I think the reason why Heterodox Academy is interested is because we're interested in individual freedom, individual rights, including due process. And we don't want, people's individual rights to be violated just because they're members of unpopular groups. And so, okay. Now, so if you can look at the share screen, so theoretically, my argument is that people who support individual rights, liberal rights proponents, generally favor liberal procedural rights and norms, such as due process and equality under the law. However, you have an influential strain of liberals today on both the political left and right who divide social groups as virtuous victims who deserve more rights and villains who deserve less. So you have the political right who defend evangelical Christians as victims, and then the left who defend racial and especially sexual minorities. So my first proposition is that religious cults such as Sincheonji or unification lack such victim status and are targeted as villains by both major left and right groups, by parties. And so I want to do an interesting case study comparison between the two epicenters of COVID-19 dissemination in Korea, which were Shincheonji and Itaewon nightclubs. Okay, and so Holly talked about Shincheonji, so I'm just gonna so I can skip most of that. So obviously so if you can see so the domestic media mostly interviewed politicians or ex-members who labeled the sect as a secretive, harmful cult, and the Western media largely repeated the cult frame of Korean media, even though the vice minister specifically stated that the Shincheonji has cooperated with authorities. Okay, We can contrast the Shincheonji case with the second epicenter, which was gay clubs in Itaewon. And so on May 1st, a 29-year-old man visited 5 bars and nightclubs and a sauna in Seoul's Itaewon district. He potentially infected 1,500 people that night. 225 tested positive because of direct or indirect contacts. Contact tracing was delayed because half of the club's visitors registered false contact information. Okay. The government did not reveal names of infected patients, but publicized via SNS their ages, geographic locations, and the names of places visited. The Korean 3T model of tracking, testing, and transparency, critics claim, violated the privacy and civil liberties of patients who did not wish to be tested or to be linked to stigmatized places. The LGBT community received strong support from Western and domestic media, which interviewed their leaders and pressed the government to respect their rights. So like US-based public radio, like MPI, the way the government is conducting contact tracing is a concern for everyone. There needs to be a better balance between human rights and privacy. Okay, and the nation's leading progressive newspaper, Hangul, experts argue that the government should temporarily implement an anonymous testing regime to encourage as many club visitors as possible to come forward for testing and thus limit the spread of the disease. There are concerns that many will be reluctant to get tested because they're afraid about homophobia. Okay. All right, so unlike Shincheonji, no nightclub owner was in prison or shut down. Okay, so many nightclub owners knew that most of the people were coming or registering false information. Okay, but they looked the other way. Okay, and unlike Shincheonji, they were not in prison. They were not shut down permanently. And so for me, I see this as kind of a double standard, right? And so these days you have progressive leading media such as Netflix that code LGBT as positive, and religious cults, conservative Christians, along with pro-Japanese collaborators, military regimes as negative. Has anyone here seen the Netflix drama Itaewon Class? Raise your hand. Okay, so I think a bunch of you in my class also very popular, right? Itaewon Class, transgender character Ma Hyun-hee, and also the handmaidens, lesbian relationship portrayed with empathy and depth. Okay, Itaewon. Okay. On the other hand, I'm sure who's seen like Save Me, Hellbound, or Parasite the Grey? Anyone seen those? Okay, you can check it out. They're mostly on Netflix, and so obviously, in here like religious groups are portrayed as basically like evil aliens, right? And the most evil alien is the church pastor. Okay. And I see the same pattern. Likewise, the mainstream media negatively frames the anti-communist Unification Church in Japan and its ties with the ruling LDP party, but ignores the political ties of the Buddhist group, okay, the Komito party, which is actually part of the ruling coalition. So I see this kind of a double standard where depending on your social group membership, your rights are either enhanced or minimized. Okay, that's my first proposition. My second proposition is a bit more positive, which is that in a liberal democracy, government prosecution encourages growth-oriented groups to do more public engagement. Okay, so Sincheonji does not just want to survive, but they want to grow. And so they realize that, because of what happened with government prosecution, instead of just hiding away, we need to engage. Okay. And so my co-author, Lee, conducted participant observation and interviews with branch leader of Shincheonji, okay, in Gyeonggi province. And so he noticed that he met Mr. K because they were out there cleaning, okay, wearing uniforms. There were beautiful people, Shincheonji. So they're actually identifying themselves, okay? And so Shincheonji learned the hard way through the pandemic that the secretive nature of the church uh, were not conducive to effective evangelism. Okay? Okay. So the church has shifted from emphasizing end-time narrative to promoting a more immediate ethic of caring for their neighbors. They have adapted their evangelism strategy to exemplify good citizenship. And so let me give you a couple of interviews. Okay. So this is from Mr. K, Shincheonji local branch leader. Despite the COVID outbreak, negative media coverage, and public perceptions, we remain committed to our church because we believe it represents the truth. The stigmatization we face taught us that remaining isolated and secretive is detrimental to our public image. That's why we decided to transform ourselves into good neighbors, working to earn the trust and respect of our fellow citizens. Okay, now, for a long time, society viewed us as deceitful in our evangelism efforts. Now we believe it's important to be transparent about who we are. We no longer want Sincheonji members to be associated with duplicity, but rather seen as good neighbors who practice Jesus' teaching to love your neighbor as yourself. Previously, some Shincheonji branches engaged with the public without disclosing our religious identity, fearing rejection. Now, we proudly display our identity with the motto, Beautiful People, Shincheonji, and work to improve our community through various outreach programs, just like LGBT Pride, okay? They're being proud of who they are, okay? Now, it's disheartening that mainstream media rarely cover our efforts to reverse the negative image. Despite our work to improve the well-being of our local communities, the general perception of Shincheonji remains predominantly negative, shaped by sensationalist headlines during the pandemic. Okay? While we accept that government authorities could punish us, we're more concerned about the cultural stigma that continues to ostracize Shincheonji. Okay? And so Sincheonji is saying we're changing, we want to be more transparent, but the media still portrays us as this bad, secretive group. Okay, they're portraying us as what we used to do in the past. So we want the media to be like, be open and transparent about who we are now, just to treat us fairly and honestly. Okay, and so my proposition 2B is, on the other hand, so when liberal governments persecute, so groups like Shincheonji, they try to engage more. On the other hand, when illiberal governments prosecute, minority groups do less engagement and become more secretive. So I think a good example is Falun Dafa in China. So Falun Dafa in China, they're very underground, secretive. On the other hand, Falun Dafa groups in liberal democracies are much more open. And so they're like openly supporting Trump, okay? So they're openly participating in politics in places like Australia, Canada, United States. They might be in Florida too, okay? Okay. So that's basically it. Thank you. And then from there, I guess we can segue to Kenji Yoshida, who's going to discuss go ahead, Kenji.
Hello, can you hear me?
You're a
Yes.
little soft. If you could speak a little closer to your microphone, that would be good.
Okay. Can you hear better?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Um, yeah, so I guess I'll talk a little bit about the dissolution of the Unification Church in Japan. So there was a district court ruling on March 25th, where the court upheld a motion that was filed by the Japanese government or the Ministry of Education to dissolve the Unification Church in Japan. And the reasoning was that they have been sort of practicing these sort of manipulative tactics to uh, manipulative recruitment practices and fundraisings. And because of the recent ruling, the Unification Church in Japan no longer has tax exemption privileges and are required to liquidate their assets. Um, yeah, so they no longer hold legal status as a religion in Japan. But the religious organization will file an appeal. Um, so So it was the first time in Japan where a religious group was ordered to was subject to a revocation order based on violation of Japan's civil code, not criminal code. And one of the reasons why the government pushed to dissolve Unification Church was, of course, the 2022 assassination of Prime Minister Abe, who was, of course, um, uh, former leader of the ruling Liberal Democratic Party. And the ruling Liberal Democratic Party has been very eager to sort of not all, but mostly to dissolve the Unification Church. And just quickly about the assassination incident, the perpetrator, the guy who assassinated Abe, held a grudge against the ruling Liberal Democratic Party because his mother was deeply affiliated with the religion, the Unification Church, and the church sort of coerced, well, allegedly coerced his mother to sort of pay and sort of cough up a lot of money to the religion. And the family was in financially bad situation, so the guy held a grudge against the religion, but also against LDP, the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, because the LDP had a close connection with the Unification Church. Um, so that's sort of the story with the recent court ruling on dissolving the Unification Church. One thing I think, Dr. E, you mentioned a little bit about sort of double standard, that the ruling LDP has been pushing to dissolve this Unification Church, but the party is in coalition government with Komeito, uh, which is largely funded by Soka Gakkai, which is another religious organization in Japan. And in fact, Komeito was a political arm of this Soka Gakkai. And so they are very close. Legally, they're a separate entity. One is, of course, a political entity, Komeito, and one is a religious entity, but they're obviously very close. And because the ruling party is in coalition with the Komeito, the LDP also gets direct or indirect support from the Soka Gakkai. And Soka Gakkai, of course, has in the past been under scrutiny for same sort of questionable behaviors that were leveled against the Unification Church. So there's that double standard as well. And yeah, there's a lawmaker in Japan that I met recently, one of the very few lawmakers who was opposed and is opposed to the dissolution of the Unification Church, um, obviously because it's an infringement on religious freedom and because of the double standard. Um, yeah. So there's still ongoing debate in Japan as to whether dissolving a religion and whether courts should have the right to decide what religion gets to stay and to what religion gets revoked, its legal status. There's still an ongoing debate. That's about it from me, my end. Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much for that fascinating summary of the legal and political situation in Japan as it relates to Shincheonji. How about we move on to John? Are you ready, John?
Yes, thank you, Francis. Thank you, Joseph, for inviting me to join in as a last minute addition to this. I'm really grateful that this discussion is happening. As has been said, I'm a scholar of religion. I focus primarily on Korea. I do a little bit of stuff with Japan. And this topic is, I think, a very important one. I've written about it previously. I'll drop my article in the chat when I get a chance. But I just want to kind of add some responses to what's been said already, and then my own sort of thoughts generally on the subject. And I want to start off with Joseph's point about this idea. I guess you could think of it as like an epistemic divide between talking about virtuous victims versus like villains. And that's definitely something that we see a lot of with any sort of marginal religious group, whether that's a new, so quote unquote, new religious movement, or a religious group that's just unpopular for some other reason. It could be regarded as foreign or new to that region, or in the case of ardent secularists, just religion is bad in general. Kind of, that's not me talking. That's like I'm quoting imaginary people. Uh, and I think also what we see in both the cases of Shincheonji in South Korea, really since, but even since 2020 with COVID, but in a sense even before that, and then very recently with the Unification Church in Japan, is a extreme case of victim blaming. Like, and it's almost an unbelievable level of victim blaming. Like Shincheonji were the people who got infected, and somehow it was their fault. Somehow they were being accused of intentionally spreading the virus. Like, who would make themselves sick and then go spread the virus? I don't understand. The whole narrative doesn't make sense. It's irrational. And then in Japan, the guy who assassinated Shinzo Abe openly said he was targeting the Unification Church. And like he wrote a manifesto which made it clear this was like an act of terrorism against the Unification Church. And somehow they are the ones that have been hit the hardest, more than anyone, perhaps except for Yamagami, because at least he wasn't put in prison, for what happened. Like it doesn't make sense, but in a way it does, unfortunately. And I think Joseph's kind of theory really helps to understand that. But why these groups specifically? Well, I think one, we see that in victim blaming, it's also shifting blame. And this is kind of related to why such religious movements exist in the first place. New religious movements are very often a response to social issues that aren't being addressed elsewhere in the society. People have anxieties. People are critical of the mainstream religions. People are critical of the government. And it's often easier when this happens, when something happens with those movements, to rather than accept that they exist for a good reason, to try to shift blame to them. And we see this in Japan with there was these allegations of corruption with the major political party. Well, it's easier to just blame Unification Church than to stop being corrupt. In the case of South Korea, a lot of what happened, I think Holly already alluded to this, and it's in some of the documents that we see written up already. I think Joseph put some of these remarks in there, that at the beginning of the pandemic, by the time the patient 31 happened, there were no major COVID restrictions in place in Korea. There were some very minor ones. There was travel restrictions on going to like Wuhan and Hubei province, but that was it. But nothing Shincheonji was doing in February 2020 was exceptional by any standard in South Korea. They're having big religious gatherings multiple times a week. That's every Protestant church in Korea. They're very crowded and sitting on the floor. Okay, they don't all sit on the floor, but a lot of religions do. They were, traveling around. There were no restrictions on Korea in that time. None of the things they did was unusual. And Unification Church is also not really that unusual in the grand scheme of how religions operate. Where is I going with this? I do the last thing I said. Oh, Holly alluded to something, I think correctly, that I did. Maybe I said this to her. Maybe she remembered it from my article, that Shincheonji almost has become like the idiom in South Korea for doing COVID wrong, even though at the time there were no rules. Such an extent that when in August 2020, which by this time there were absolutely major restrictions in place, when a mainstream, albeit far right Protestant pastor, Chung Kwang-hoon, and his Sarang Jail Church blatantly organized a demonstration in the public square in Seoul in protest of the government, and said that they openly knew they were violating restrictions. They were labeled by the media as second Shincheonji. But the thing is, like, they knew what they were doing wrong. Shincheonji didn't blatantly do anything wrong on purpose. Like, I feel like this should be a whole new level, like, that they should be blamed for. And also, this kind of speaks to the theme that Joseph pointed out on what Heterodox Academy is doing here. The precedent with Shincheonji or the handling of Shincheonji kind of set a precedent in South Korea during COVID that somehow violating the rights of minority groups was acceptable for public health, which is why suddenly when it was threatened to happen to the LGBT community, and then later to foreigners, as happened in the city of Jinhae in South Korea a little bit later in the pandemic, then people started to care. But they didn't seem to care as much when it was Shincheonji. Um, Let me just wrap up and talking a little bit more about kind of, I think, are some major theoretical and methodological issues that come about why we think of these religions, so-called new religious movements, in this way. There's a lot of problems with terminology that gets used and thrown around to essentially sort of delegitimize already marginalized religious groups as sort of being not real religions. Cult, that's also popularly used in Japan, karuto. Pseudo-religion, which would be Saibi Jongyo in Korean, it's very commonly used today. Heresy, Idan, and of course, just even new religion itself could be problematic, but we scholars can't seem to find a way around that one. And then the way these are talked about, and this relates, I think, especially to the idea of heresy, in Korea in particular, and I think also in Japan, a lot of information that's spread about these movements, one is just reflexive reporting. The media copies other media. They copy what they kind of think is normal, which is often the mainstream politically dominant religions. But also, they tend to rely on a couple or maybe like two or three kinds of problematic sources. One is that, especially in South Korea, and I think to a lesser extent in Japan and even in US, a lot of the religion experts are grounded in one of the mainstream traditions, which in and of itself is fine. But when you ask them for opinions on marginal religions with which their traditions are competing, you're going to get a biased answer. And these were the most of the experts that were asked initially about Shincheonji in Korea in 2020. The other problem is the so quote unquote cult expert. And I'll tell you right now, someone calls themselves a cult expert, they are not a cult expert. like these were often the people who were asked about Unification Church in Japan a couple of years ago. But religious studies scholars don't call themselves cult experts, and we don't tend to use that term without saying it's problematic. The final one, and I probably alluded to this briefly at the end, is apostate accounts. Often the narratives of so quote unquote insiders are people who intentionally left and continue to hold a grudge against the religion. And not that these shouldn't be listened to, like if people have accounts of what happened to them, yes, take it seriously. But at the other time, remember that there's a bias here. I don't really think I have a good tidy wrap up to this other than just to say I do appreciate a lot of the comments that I saw in the discussion document, and I'm really impressed with what I've seen there. And I think there's a good way to start thinking about how members of different religious groups can start to, or should at least try to take each other seriously. Uh, and we shouldn't let what's normal for one religion decide what is wrong about another religion. Now, granted, as Holly alluded to, uh, Shincheonji is guilty of this in and of themselves with their own critiques of the mainstream Protestants. However, they would be far from the first and definitely not going to be the last people to critique mainstream Protestantism or any other religion in Korea today. But one religion doesn't get to decide what is religion for everyone else.
Thank you so much for those points, John. And don't worry if there's no neat wrap up, because these are, of course, complicated and ongoing questions, which we shall very smoothly transition into the Q&A. I'm just going to change to gallery mode so I can see everyone. So if everyone could turn on their cameras if possible, that would be really nice. We may not all be members of Shincheonji, but I'm sure you are all beautiful people. So please turn on your cameras and we can interact a bit more. Joseph, I have some questions, but I'd like to leave it to your students and any of the high schoolers first. So did any of them have questions?
Yes, so let me introduce our middle and high school volunteers for Heterodox Academy, because we always want to teach liberty for all ages. Okay, so I see Gabriel Park. Ellie, are you ready? So we can do Gabriel, Park, Aaron, and Nicole, and any other volunteers who came. So Gabriel, you have the floor.
Hi, my name's Gabrielle Park, and I'm a student at Oxford Academy, and I'm also a Christian Asian American. So I understand that everyone has different ideas and beliefs, and I believe that everyone deserves religious freedom. And after I did some research, I have learned that members of the Shincheonji group have not always been treated with respect, especially with recent incidents during the pandemic. Much hate has been directed to the Shincheonji. However, I believe that both Christians and the Shincheonji should always treat each other with respect while still furthering their faith. And yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ellie. Aaron, are you ready?
Yes. So, hello, my name is Aaron Han, and I go to La Mara High School. And similar to Gabriel Park, I've grown up in a Christian household, and I'm a Christian Asian American. And also, researching about the Shincheonji group, I realized that they have been oppressed for their beliefs because it contradict with traditional Christian beliefs. And I feel like the contradicting beliefs shouldn't really be a reason for any hate or direct harm towards the Shincheonji group, as especially living in the United States, freedom is something that we should all be fighting for, right? And but at the same time, I believe that respect should be mutual. And I also learned about some incidents with Shincheonji and how they have actually used like fake websites, and there's like stories on my online social media platforms of previous Shincheonji members that have actually had a lot have been broken because of the Shincheonji group. And I just think that it's important that we as traditional Protestant Christians treat Shincheonji and any other religious group with respect, but also receive the same in return. And I noticed that there's a lot of Christian movements that attack the Shincheonji and their beliefs, and I don't think that's right. Um, but at the same time, it should be a mutual relationship that goes on between the religions. So thank you.
Okay, and then our third volunteer is Nicole Kim.
Hi, my name is Nicole Kim. I go to Valencia High School. I'm a junior. I am Korean and I was born into a strictly Christian family, like since I was born. And it was me and my brother and both of my parents. Um, all my life I was raised as a Christian and I was always kind of like always active in the church, and I was always grown around people who were very strictly Christian. And so all my life I've kind of been aware of like what is considered cults, or Shincheonji. I've only heard about their name once or twice, but 2 years ago in 2023 I finally got the chance to be educated by a speaker whose name is Pastor Ezra Kim. He has a YouTube channel on Shincheonji actually, and he came to educate some of us to uh, help us discern what the beliefs of Shincheonji are and what the beliefs of the Presbyterian Church is. And so through that, I've actually got to learn a lot about the different points in our beliefs and the different aspects on how our beliefs and thoughts may differ. And actually, although I've been raised in like a Christian household, and of course my thoughts may be biased, and my family actually has some hurt through some Shincheonji members in the past, so my thoughts can be totally biased, but I still believe that we should treat each other with respect, because although people may accuse them of being a cult or accuse them of being very disrespectful to others, I believe that some Christians may actually be disrespectful to other religions as well. So I believe that all religions should actually be respectful to each other. And even if our beliefs and our viewpoints are different, I don't think we should ever judge or criticize others just for their beliefs. Um, but however, I also wish that other religions, such as Shincheonji, may also treat other religions with respect and like value each other's space and beliefs as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for those thoughtful words, Nicole. Now back to Francis to open up Q&A?
Yeah. Yep. So we're opening up the Q&A. Thank you very much to our brave high school volunteers, Gabrielle, Aaron, and Nicole. Joseph, how much time have we got for Q&A? I think you're on mute.
2 minutes?
2 minutes. All right. I hope it's all right if I just cram in a question then. This is a question to Holly. So as I mentioned, I didn't understand that much about Shincheonji because I'm coming from an Australian perspective. Although I'm curious about your thoughts because I think it's a few months ago now, but there was a big news feature on Shincheonji in ABC News. And it was it was in fact about Perth, this very isolated city in Western Australia where I completed my postgrad studies. And I would describe the news feature overall as quite negative, very much picturing the Shincheonji people as these cold leaders who were sucking in undergrads from, the University of Western Australia and places like that. And I was curious to know, why do you think the mainstream Australian news coverage has been so negative when a lot of the points you mentioned about why there was so much resistance was from the Korean perspective in the way that they criticize other Korean Protestants and I guess
I'll jump in and I'll answer because I know we're running out of time.
Yes.
There is an enormous amount of anti-cult and anti-religious minority activity that's happening globally right now. And I can't take over. We would need an entire new webinar to explain it. But there's a massive amount of international coordination. I could explain it country by country. There are public-private partnerships that are involved. We suspect that there are certain governments that are involved. There are definitely NGOs that are involved. There are media companies that are involved, but there's an enormous amount of messaging right now to create negative views about religion in general, but specifically against religious minorities when it's easy to present them as toxic. And so I think of Shincheonji as a local problem for Korea, but the messaging about Shincheonji internationally is comporting very strongly with a larger narrative about religion being connected to abuse, religion being connected to spiritual harm, religion being connected to something that provides bad outcomes for children and young people. And I've been speaking in a lot of different contexts about the reasons to be suspicious about this type of messaging and the reasons why there are ominous overtones, not just for religion, but also for secular civil liberties. Just as a side note, in addition to the Unification Church in Japan, the Jehovah's Witnesses have also been targeted. And there's been a campaign by a group of lawyers. I responded for the Jehovah's Witnesses and helped write a document that was sent to the Japanese government. And as a consequence, I read some of the documents by the Japanese lawyers, which were provided to me in translation. And in the lawyers' statements, they say they are not simply interested in going after the Jehovah's Witnesses or by extension, the Unification Church. They want government regulation of any family that teaches beliefs that are counter to the beliefs of mainstream society. And under that viewpoint, anybody who had a non-majority view on sexuality, on environmentalism, on politics, on health, on vegetarianism or homeschooling would be vulnerable to regulation. Japan is a large, complicated, industrial democracy with freedom of religion, and to the extent that there are changes there, they would be regarded as precedent setting for other, full-blown democracies. And so, in other words, this is something that can't just be contained in Japan, but the agenda is global and everybody should care.
Okay, let me add to that. I
Sure.
want to start by saying it's not just religious groups, but I see a lot of in Western democracies, you see strong political campaigns against villains, right? So both the left and the right, like right now in the US, you're seeing all these conservative going after like DEI or pro-Palestinian protesters. They're saying like, in a way, like, well, these are like pseudo, DEI is like this pseudo religious group, irrational, or like these, pro-Hamas people. So we need to like go after them. And we don't really care about due process rights or individual freedom because they're bad people. We need to like deport them, get them out of our country ASAP. So we see that among, conservatives in America, but also we see that here in Korea. Right now, like after the, President Yoon's, martial law declaration, now the Democratic Party is saying like the whole conservative party, they're a bunch of insurrectionists. They're trying to overthrow the government. They don't deserve to ever be, participate in politics again. Okay. And so I think this is a kind of thinking that leads to things like, like progressives in Romania canceling the election because they didn't want the Conservative Party candidate to win because they're being controlled by Russia. And so I'm saying that, so it's not just Shincheonji or Unification Church. There's a lot of political campaigns out there to target certain social groups, and that's willing to violate their individual and due process rights. And so I think as members of Heterodox Academy, we want to be careful about any attack on anyone's freedoms, okay? No matter who they are, whether they're left or right. Okay.
If I can add to that, one thing which I am very, very aware of is every country where there are attacks on religious minorities, there are also attacks against political activists and people who are working for social change in a variety of situations. And so, in other words, this is very, very seldom something that simply is contained for people who are religious. It's something that almost always extends to secular groups as well.
Okay, great. Francis, one of my students had a question.
Of course.
Okay. Russell? All right. Your name and where you're from?
Hello, I'm Russell. I'm a Catholic and I'm from Indonesia, but I'm currently studying in Germany. I actually had a question regarding the legal and financial status of a lot of these non-heterodox churches. Or smaller religious organizations. So most religious organizations, most countries have tax exemptions for religious organizations and churches, and for NGOs. And in regards to the Unification Church case, at least to my knowledge, a lot of the attacks on the Unification Church are due to alleged extortion or how they get money from members of their church. If I remember correctly, I remember reading somewhere that there was a large reason why churches in general get this tax exemption is because they function sort of as a non-profit or as an organization that works for the benefit of people. How exactly would it be for such churches or religious organizations that accrue a lot of financial wealth and hold financial assets? I'd want to know how it specifically works, especially for the smaller ones or the the non-Orthodox ones, like larger Protestant or Catholic churches. Is there a difference in legality or how the government would view it from a smaller church towards, a normal, a more accepted church, more mainstream churches?
Looks like Holly has her hand up.
Yeah, maybe Holly or John.
Okay, sure. I think it's important to start by making a distinction between what's legal, what's ethical, and what we just don't like, right? And so there are different frameworks for critiquing a group or an organization, and there are different responses based on what's the right framework to apply for a critique. Now, I don't think it's really fair to assert that the Unification Church extorted money from their members. I don't think that the members who made those donations would say that they were being extorted. It is true that certain members made large donations, very often either for building campaigns or for ceremonies called ancestor liberation. The challenge has to do with how you assign value. First of all, there are many, many churches and religious groups that have capital campaigns and ask for donations, so this is not something that's confined to unificationism, and there are secular organizations and art societies and universities and lots of people fundraise, and that's normal. In the case of something that's religious, you have an additional question that shows up, which is how do you calculate value, right? And so if somebody makes a donation for, say $5,000 or $10,000, they're donating because they consider something of spiritual value. And if they get something small as a token response, they're not buying the monument, they're buying the ability to donate to the cause, and in that sense, whatever they get in return is a commemoration. In the same way that if you donate $500 to National Public Radio, you get a coffee cup, right? Whereas the coffee cup isn't really worth $500. And so what I can say is basically, look, religions follow religious minorities, they follow the same laws and the same rules as religious majorities. If you want to have a question with what Shincheonji is, or not Shincheonji, sorry, unificationism is doing in terms of ancestor liberation, which is a core of the reason why they're fundraising. Well, there are other religions that also do similar ceremonies. I mean, the Catholic Church, the ceremonies that are very, very similar to ancestor liberation in terms of some of their, what's it called? I'm forgetting the name of it because I'm an East Asian scholar more often. Indulgences, thank you, indulgences. And so I don't know, I mean, I just guess that what I want to sort of say is, look, in answer to the question that was raised earlier as well, there are certain areas where I could understand why a religious person or even a secular person would not like some of the theology or some of the values of religious minorities. They're often exclusivist, as in they see themselves as having the only pathway to salvation. To be fair, Shincheonji does try to work with other organizations and other faith traditions, as does unificationism, but these are religions that see themselves as, the next step for Christianity and the next step for humanity. And it's going to be very, very hard for them to operate in a way that's forward thinking and also think of themselves as lateral with other denominations. And so I think we have to recalibrate what we expect in terms of respect and say, look, it's unfortunate that some groups see themselves as theologically superior to others, but I don't think that that should govern a government's reaction. That's a place where there are other avenues in society for the criticism. So that would be my response.
Is that okay?
Yeah. Can I have a follow-up question? Sure. What do you think of the Western European model of having church taxes instead of large donations? Because that's something you can't really opt out of unless you change your religion. In certain Western European countries, you have to pay a church tax from your income.
I think this is one of the funniest things, that Americans think of our country as completely imbricated with religion, whether we worry about a separation of church and state, and yet we're the only industrial democracy, it seems, that doesn't have state support for religion. And this is a place where I myself actually really believe in the American system. I think that religion should have to go compete for themselves. I myself personally don't favor state support of religion. And I recognize that this is maybe a cultural idiosyncrasy of being American.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you, Russell. Yay. Okay, back to you, Francis.
Yeah, thank you for the question and for the thoughtful answer. It looks like I do want to be respectful of everyone's time, and you've all been very patient. So thank you very much for visiting. Unless there are any burning questions or dying last remarks, then perhaps we can close up here. And thanks so much to all of the speakers for your time and your wisdom, and to our high school volunteers for sharing their thoughts, and to everyone who came and asked questions and listened very patiently.